Welcome to Modus Cafe. Join us for fun, lighthearted, and educational conversations around training, athletic longevity, and the human side of climbing. With your hosts, Mercedes Pollmeyer and Katja Dev.
Okay, welcome back, everybody, to Modus Cafe. Today, with a very exciting episode, Mercedes and I are very excited to talk about grades today, and I've already made all the grade jokes. Being a non-native speaker and, me mispronouncing things all the time, I make a lot of grade jokes when we talk about grades. Yeah, we decided to talk about grades today. As most of you know, grades are a really hot topic at any time, but we decided to talk about grades today because Mercedes just posted a really amazing Instagram post. And it was very popular. People loved it. I love it. I loved it. I still love it, Mercedes. I mean, you really put so much thought into that one post, and it was really, really wonderful. If you don't know what we're talking about, I encourage you to go to our Instagram, go to Modus Athletica, and check out that post that we just posted last week. She pretty much just shared a few thoughts about grades and maybe better ways to approach the grading system or alternative ways to approach the grading system. So we thought we would take up this discussion today, and sort of our big goal is to put grades in reference to what is really important and maybe how we can use them and maybe how we might not want to use them and what the downsides are, the grading system. All right, with that, should we get started?
Yeah.
So where do grades really come from?
We're not going to really go into the history of it. You can look it up on Wikipedia if you want to know the history of grading. But this is really, I think, the understanding of who comes up with these grades.
Yes.
Right.
It's so interesting, as a scientist, so my former life before I became a coach, I was a scientist, and I was always fascinated with this idea of where does knowledge in our textbooks come from, right? When we grow up, we go to school, and I think we open these textbooks and we just take anything that's written in these textbooks for granted. Now, the truth is, when you go and study science, the problem is scientists write these textbooks, but they really have to simplify. They can't really write these complicated theories into textbooks. They have to simplify and then put something in the textbook that actually might not be really true. It might be okay true. It might relate to the truth, but it's not the absolute truth with a capital T, right? And grades are somewhat similar. Like, someone came up with these grades, someone printed a book, and now we just look at these books and we're like, oh my gosh, that is the grade. And that's kind of what we want to talk about, is when we say, where do grades come from? Yeah, it's not the history of the grading system, but it's this idea of, okay, you want to go and check out this climb in Joshua Tree, and you look it up in the book and it says V3. And so you might think, okay, that climb is a V3, exclamation point. And what we really want to discuss is where does the grade come from? Like, who put that grade into this book, and what does it really mean?
Yeah, and I think it can also depend on area. As you know, a V3 in Joshua Tree is so different to a V3 in Joe's Valley, and
exactly.
That also plays a huge part in this. And to go back to your textbook analogy, really when we're measuring something like math, there are distinct numbers. 1 is a 1, 2 is a 2, 3 is a 3. It's factual. But in climbing, there's no facts. It's so variable because, humans are variable. The rock can be variable. So how is it that we are now putting these numbers that are factual on something that is not, And
Yes, I love that you use math as a numbers, because especially in climbing, what's interesting, that the way grades come about for certain boulders often by the person or from a person who does the first ascent. That person gets to, I say get to because I think there's a lot of pressure to grade something. If you do a first ascent, you have to grade a boulder, and people think, oh, they get to grade a boulder, but that's a lot of pressure. There's responsibility because people take those grades for granted sometimes, not always. There's discussion. But, you know, it's, let's say it's one person that comes up with a grade. And I do understand, I've actually talked to someone who has published a guidebook before. And I talked to him about the process of it. And people who publish guidebooks, they do try to take other people's ideas of a grade into consideration. So there's some discussion around it. But traditionally, people who graded a lot of routes and boulders were mostly, for one, still men, because, you know, men are still dominating the sport, and they were certainly dominating the sport at the beginning. And, you know, and for example, with that, men tend to be, you know, on average, a little bit taller than women on average, right? So, of course, you know, that is already one way of how grades might be skewed. Men also tend to be a little less flexible. So then it could be that women, you know, might give something a different grade because they tend to be more flexible. But not only, so grades come about from just a small group of people who decide on a grade initially. Also, often what happens, a lot of people who do publish guidebooks, they tend to be really strong climbers, which means they might or might not have a harder time grading the easier problems. So some of you out there might have noticed that you go to an area and you find yourself that the V0s and the V1s and the V2s are all really, really hard. And, you know, part of that might be, and, you know, I'm not saying that's the truth again, that people who grade these problems are really experienced climbers, and they might just, you know, not remember what it's like to climb V0 and V1 and V2. And then it's, you know,
Yeah.
it's a small group of people, and once we have these grades in the book, it tends to be that guideline we base everything off.
And I think, you know, I'm going to play a little bit like devil's advocate here, because it is interesting, like V0, like it should be accessible to a relatively inexperienced climber. Like you probably have to be a climber in order to climb V0 outside. But I think gyms now, with like this like evolution of gyms, V0 feels very different now in people's minds. You know, and I think that comparing gym climbs to outdoor climbs, you know, now it gets even more messy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you know, keep in mind that like gym holds are created by humans as well, and the gym climbs are created by humans, whereas like outside it is more nature. And I think outdoors can be trickier to grade, especially at those low grades,
Mm-hmm.
because of what you mentioned. And something we don't do a really good job of is that there is this like transition from gym to crag, where you have to think about safety. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you see V1 in a guidebook, it's not a V1 like you would see in a gym. It's probably not super safe. It's, you probably need a lot of pads, and you probably need to know how to fall and feel really secure being pretty high off the ground. So there's all of these other factors that we don't really consider in the gym either, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just a side note, because I don't think we didn't really have that in our notes today, but um like keep that in mind. Like if you are kind of a newer outdoor climber coming from the gym to outdoors, be really smart and cautious about even those entry level grades.
Mm-hmm.
V0 to V3, those sometimes can cause the most injuries outside for newer
Mm-hmm.
climbers.
Yeah. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think part of that is what I was trying to say, is that they are often not as easy as they sound. Because, you know, because grading ultimately is subjective. Like someone put these grades in a guidebook, and these grades were not put in the guidebook by someone who climbs V0 to V3. So then someone who actually climbs V0 to V3 might have a different experience on these boulders than people who climb V10 plus and say, oh, this is a V0 or a V3. Because of course, to those people, it's a lot easier. So yeah, I love that you
Yeah.
put a word of caution in there. So that's something definitely to keep in mind, that, you know, people who might have graded these boulders, they might be a different climber than you. And
Mhm.
that leads really perfectly into the next discussion point, which is what are the downsides to the grading system? You know, there's many downsides. And again, you know, we already talked about it. It's, you know, climbs are subjective to begin with. Someone is trying to give an objective grade, a number to a boulder, but ultimately it's a subjective experience because people come in all different shapes and forms. People come with different skill levels and different experience levels, into climbing. But there's many other things that affect a grade, even just like the weather and conditions. Like now this is like thinking about climbing outside, right? Like a V2 will feel very different outside when the weather is perfect for that type of rock versus when the weather is not perfect. Or, as you mentioned already, like a certain grade in different areas could feel very, very different. And again, those were also graded by different people. It's not like we have this one guru who goes around the world and decides, okay, this is a V2 in England, this is a V2 in the US, they're all now about the same. No, these are like different people putting up grades and they have different personal experiences. What else, Mercedes? So we have like what are other shortcomings of the grading system? One, rock can
Um,
change over time. We
yeah,
talked
I
about
think
this.
this one, especially in very popular areas, and I know we keep talking about boulders. This is also
Yeah,
true for rope climbs.
absolutely. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like with a lot of like climbs that get a lot of traffic, it can either make it harder because now there's shoe rubber on certain holds, which makes it less sticky. Or it could, if it's sandstone or something, maybe um, the erosion happens naturally and holds maybe get better. Sometimes they get worse. And we don't always keep that into consideration. Even just the earth or like
Mhm.
the start holds, the earth will continue to degrade over time, and so now these start holds are starting to get higher and higher. That changes the feel of the climb as well. um
Absolutely. Granite can get polished, polished,
mhm.
climbs are a lot harder than they might have been initially. It's actually really interesting because we have this idea that rocks are so like sturdy and they don't change. We have this idea that, oh, in the gym, there's a new set every week and grades are all variable, but they are actually variable outside quite a bit too. Like as you
Yeah.
said, even the earth, like even like the relative position of the start holes. There's this one boulder where I climb where there's apparently this really good foot that now you can't get to anymore because there's now been a lot of like dirt washed in and you would have to dig out the boulder in order to start it properly, like the original boulder.
Mm.
And so it's really funny. Holds break,
Oh man.
there's all sorts of things that can happen
And
that
there's a lot of
change.
ethics around that too. Like for example, like your start foothold is now covered by earth. Is it okay to remove that earth now?
Yeah.
You know, some people might
Mm-hmm.
say yes, some people might say no.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these things change. Like people will remove rocks from landings. Does that change the grade? And is it ethical to move those rocks? You know, um,
Mm-hmm.
we won't go too much into ethics. I'm not really. I try to stay out
Mm-hmm.
of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so all of these things change the feel of the climb. It changes your mentality of the climb as well, especially if it feels scary, um, less secure because of your surroundings. That's going to factor into the grade. And when first ascensionists do climbs, they take all of these things into consideration. It's not just the rock movement or strength needed. It is how tall it is, how scary it is, what's the
Mm-hmm.
fall risk. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely. I mean, even in the gym, I've spent some time talking to root setters about how they set the grades. And, certainly like the position of the difficult moves, whether or not they're like, really high off the ground, like with a high risk of, falling pretty far versus low off the ground, all of that is being put into consideration.
Yeah.
And if we imagine even like how we feel from one day to the next, like how tired we are, just really how we feel personally can affect like how we might experience a rock climb, how hard it is, like from one day to the next, even, or from 1 week to the next, from 1 year to the next. It's almost like it's always a new experience every time we climb rock, or even in the gym. Some people might have experienced this, like the V4 that you climbed last week all of a sudden feels a lot easier, a lot harder this week. And
Yeah.
so that's something to keep in mind when we think about grades. It's so subjective. And that's kind of like where we're trying to lead a little bit, what we
Yeah.
want to share with people is that, climbing is a very personal journey, and grades are part of that. They're part of your personal journey. You kind of have the power and the responsibility to use the grades for your own journey and
Yeah.
not let that affect you by other people.
Yeah. And remember that grades aren't often just measuring strength or intensity. One of my good friends, Tande Kateo, he is an amazing setter. He lived in Seattle for a while, and I got to know him, and I got to learn like his philosophy on how to grade things. And he used the RIC scale, RIC. And I think a lot of gyms have adopted it, and maybe they're moving away from it. I'm not sure. These things seem to change pretty quickly, but RIC stands for risk, intensity, and complexity. And so you can give each scale kind of a number, like, okay, the risk was really high on this boulder, but the intensity was super low and it was moderate complexity. And so like when you kind of like deconstruct a climb in that way, you could maybe do that for yourself. Like as you're climbing, instead of going straight to the grade, you could say, this didn't feel very risky for me. It did feel really intense. And, the complexity was really high. So you can kind of think of these things on a scale, for yourself as you're trying to measure progress. I really like the scale. I try to use it as well and for my own climbing, because I notice that I trend towards certain types of climbs and I do better on those certain types of climbs. And so in a way to kind of diversify my climbing, I think of this RIC scale. Yeah, and try some different things there. So, like think, that might help you get away from grades a little bit, if you think about it that way.
I love that too. And maybe that's a nice segue into upgrading, downgrading, community grading, and personal
Yeah.
grading. So that's something I want to cover. So I want to cover upgrading, downgrading, community grading, and personal grading.
Yeah.
And the RIC scale, actually, our root setters use the same one. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to keep in mind. Remind me that I talk about my sort of pet peeve when it comes to grades, because it has to do with the complexity of a grade and the skill required to climb something. And there's something that I see talked about in the internet a lot that gets me fired up, which I will share in a second. But when should we upgrade and downgrade certain climbs? How are we changing climbs? We just talked about how conditions change climbs. It's really subjective, and maybe there's usually a small group of people that have initially graded a climb for the guidebooks, but now there's more and more community platforms coming up, like 8As, Kaya, and also Mountain Project. These are like community grades. So people can submit grades, and now the grades are generated based on a larger group of people, which makes statistics a lot easier and nicer. And not only that, so actually community grades, I cannot see that be the future of climbing personally. I see community grades and personal grades, but the personal grades feed into community grades, right? And so what's really nice about community grading is when you go to these platforms and you can see what other people have graded these climbs, it gives you an idea for the range too. So not only do you now get an average grade, but what's even better is you can see a distribution. And as those apps get better, we can see better distributions also based on, which is what Kaya is doing, based on body type too. So you can get a better sense for, how would this boulder maybe feel for me? It looks like, some of these boulders or like some of these climbs on Mountain Project have really huge ranges of grades. And people might get a sense for, well, how might this feel for me? How might this grade feel for me? And this is where I want to talk about personal grades a little bit, because that's been one of the most revealing, I don't know if revealing is the right word, things for me that I've learned from some really strong women here in Salt Lake City, climbing with them, is this idea of, wow, they give themselves their own grades. And this was mind-blowing to me because, I was one of these people. I grew up in the climbing world, and I would just go to the guidebook, or I would just go to a platform, and I would just always take the grade that was published somewhere as the grade. And I wouldn't really change the grade for me personally, but I've seen some really strong women sometimes like really upgrade some clients, right? And be really confident. And well, these are women who also have a lot of experience, and they know that range of grade really well. And I think it's really inspiring, just this idea of, hey, this is a personal grade for myself. You know, I think that can be really freeing sometimes. Disregarding what other people are saying, because in the end, climbing is our own journey, right? And so you can decide for yourself. And at this point, I also want to talk about this concept of, I'm sure, I don't know, you've probably seen it. I've seen it a lot. There's a lot of downgrading. To me, like in my community, when I go to these apps, I just talked about the community grades, right? I think they're wonderful. I think the idea of the community grade is wonderful. It would actually be wonderful if the whole community was represented. Right now, the community grade is not a community grade, because only certain types of people actually submit their grade to these apps. And again, it's still very male dominated. You know, it's also dominated by people who feel really confident because they feel like they can submit these grades. And here I am. I just want to encourage everybody out there listening to contribute to these community grades on whatever app you're using. You can use anonymous names if you want to, but if you share your experience, then we would get better community grades altogether. And the community grade wouldn't be based on, again, like a very narrow group of people in terms of diverse body shapes and experience, you know? And one thing that I find interesting, there's a lot of downgrading happening. I think people feel more comfortable downgrading. And the one thing that I told you before I want to talk about is this idea of, I see this a lot with women too, that I want to speak to, because, you know, someone listening might relate to this. Let's say you are a V4 climber and you've climbed a lot of V4s. Because one of the things with grading something is we do need a little bit of experience in that general grade level to really say, how does a grade compare? So let's say, Mercedes, you are a V4 climber and you've done, let's say, how many V4s have you done? Maybe 20, and you're trying to break into V5. So you've done 20-ish V4s, some of them hard, some of them really hard, some of them really easy. Like you're like a really solid V4 climber. Now you just climbed your first V5 and you climbed it in one session. And then you come to me, and this happens to me a lot. And you're like, I just climbed my first V5. I'm so excited. But I don't really think it was a V5. Okay, when you do that, one, you're taking away someone else's success in some ways, because, you know, you're saying everybody else who's climbed this V5 actually didn't climb a V5, they climbed a V4. But most importantly, when we break into a new grade, chances are good we chose a climb that is our style. Again, if something is our style, something is going to naturally feel easier to us than other people. So the person next to you, like projecting this V5, that might be their anti-style, and it might feel really hard to them, even though they've climbed a lot of V5s already. And also, if this is the first of the grade and you haven't climbed any other V5 before, you might not really know what V5 feels like. You might not know that. And so I would just say, if you climb a new grade, just take it. Just take it and be, you know, feel happy about it. You just climb something hard for you, whether or not this V4 or V5. Just like leave it at that for this moment, you know, for this time being. Don't just diminish your success immediately. And the last thing I like to tell these people is, like, let's say, okay, you are arguing with me. You're like, no, Katja, but it felt so easy. Then I would be like, okay, if this V5 felt so easy to you that you would call it a V4, then please, please upgrade all the really, really hard V4s that you've already done that might have actually been V5s. And then, you know, we're good. And I'm like, okay, well, you've done your V5, you know, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about is when there's these athletes who have done like a ton of, let's say, 12Ds, and they really want to do 13A. And sometimes we have this mental blockage around it. Sometimes I have a conversation with them and I have them pick really, really difficult 12Ds. And then we even go into the community grade and the personal experience. I'm like, okay, if you've done like 30 or 50, whatever, 12Ds, some of them were so hard, way harder than all the other ones. Chances are good that might have already been a 13A. So, you know, congratulations, you've already climbed a 13A. It's just that someone else has not printed a book saying it's 13A. So I think this is how grades are really relative, and there's definitely a range. And a lot of gyms now, choose ranges of grades. Okay, that was a long monologue. Thanks for listening to me talk about this. I mean, how do you feel about upgrading versus downgrading? I do think grades can and should change, but I think we have to keep in mind that there's variability in it.
Yeah. I mean, you already said it, like we're so comfortable downgrading things, but we're not comfortable upgrading things. And I do admire when there are athletes that say, oh no, this actually felt harder, and they will take that grade. And, like that takes a lot of confidence, and kind of like you have to be brave to do it, because it feels like maybe we're not allowed to upgrade things because
Mm-hmm.
it's so tied to ego.
Mm-hmm.
Like you really need to earn that grade, if you're gonna upgrade that thing. Like, do
Mm-hmm.
do you? Like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Totally.
yeah. But I think the community grades is nice, and I really like the concept. Like the grade ranges I think are wonderful. I'm so glad that so many gyms are really doing like the circuit system. And you can apply that to outside, like Fontainebleau. I love Fontainebleau because it's mostly based on a great like a circuit system. They
Mm-hmm.
still have some like very specific grades for those boulders. But a friend of mine that I climbed with, Paul Nadler, many years ago, like when I first started climbing in Squamish, when I first started climbing in Squamish, Squamish is not my style. Full stop.
Mm-hmm. I remember
And
that.
it
When you
is,
first started, you
oh
were
my
like, there's
gosh.
no feet.
Yeah, there's no feet. They're like, sure, there's some crimps for sure, but like it is a very open-handed, like
Mm-hmm.
open hand style of climbing, a lot of compression. And I got really upset. I got really upset at myself. I got really upset at the like the area. I think I really hated climbing for a while. I'm like, okay, I need to take a step back a little bit. Like, what can this area teach me? But when I was climbing with Paul, and it was like maybe my first year in Squamish, and he said something very important to me that I use this system. He's like, take the grade ±2. I'm like, oh my God. Yes, I love that. Plus or minus, that is like a huge range. And for sure it fits in that range somewhere, you
Yes.
know?
Yeah.
And
No,
yeah, like that really like changed my mindset. I was like, yeah, you're right. I don't have to stick to this grade. I can put my body and into that grade and take a plus or minus for it.
yeah,
Yeah.
wouldn't that be wonderful?
Yeah.
We just had all these grades. I
Yeah.
mean, in the end, too, the way I feel is I just climbed this rock. I just, oh my goodness, I tried so hard and I climbed this rock,
Yeah.
and it felt so good to put
Yeah.
all of this work in and climb this rock.
Yep.
How about why don't we give each climb 2 grades? One, a difficulty grade, and the second
Mhm.
one, how did I feel grade? How did that
Yeah.
experience? How did that experience, feel for me grade? That's my
Yeah.
personal grade. Like that's my experience grade, my
Totally.
EG. My
Yeah.
climbing EG.
Yeah.
Because really that really is what matters.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
you and I also come from this desire to love climbing for as
Yeah.
long as possible. And
Yeah.
we aren't professional climbers at the top level who aren't
Mm-hmm.
getting paid for this, who
Mm-hmm.
might not like go to all of the competitions. So I think for most of us, like having like a kind of a more relaxed view on grading is it's you're allowed to do that. You're
Mm-hmm.
allowed, you know.
Yeah,
Um
that's something, yeah, to maybe share with people. It's like if you're not a pro climber, which I think if you are, you might not be listening to our podcast.
no.
But if you're listening, that's awesome too. No, but it's really important to keep in mind, why do we climb? That's
Mhm.
something we're like coming back to with the grading system too. This is usually a personal journey that we're going on because we love climbing for personal reasons. And ultimately what it comes down to, I think we use grades to measure progress. And it is one way to measure progress. In some ways, we're not saying, oh, throw out all the grades. I actually do think there's some importance to grades. Maybe we should talk about this now, because it happened to me once at a gym. The idea is that, especially, not even newer climbers, but any climber, when you approach a climb, you want to have a general sense of difficulty. And, before you approach the climb, also for safety reasons, as you said. And I remember I climbed at this gym. I don't want to name names right now, but I remember that for the grade that I had given that climb, it felt very difficult in a very insecure, dangerous way, because it was the way you were falling could hurt people. And I remember talking to them about this at the front desk. I was like, because I was, knew these people, and I was like, I don't know this. I feel like if someone at that level gets on that climb, they might hurt themselves. No, I don't have a crystal ball, but someone did get hurt. Someone did get hurt because, someone thought they could do this climb based on the grade and, fell in this insecure spot. And then they called me up and they were like, okay, Katja, what would you give this? What grade would you give this? And I upgraded it by 2, actually, just to make it a little safer for people and just to know to approach this climb with a certain respect, for what it might be. Because as you said, there's so many components that go into this. So grades are important to just give us a general idea. Because yeah, it would be lovely if we could all just read the route, assess the route, and based on that decide if we could climb it or not. So grades do have their place, and not only for assessing if you might want to try a certain climb or not. Guidebooks are usually pretty great because they do also say, they indicate how dangerous a climb might be. But we also talked about this. They can measure some progress in some way, especially if you climb in the same area. This could be the same gym or the same area outside, and like during the generally same type of year, same type of season. So the weather might be somewhat similar, and sort of like the progress can be measured like over time with a lot of averages. Now, people out there who might know a little bit about math and statistics, they know in order to really say something confidently with a confidence interval, really using averages, you actually need a lot of numbers. You need to have done a lot of things. And then, as you said, Mercedes, then we can kind of see like this sliding scale, like an upward trend. Grades can help us to see an upward trend. Single grades are not going to tell us a ton necessarily, but we might see an upward trend in our climbing progression, especially if we break it down maybe into styles as well. If we not just compare, okay, I can climb V5. Well, what does that mean? Can you climb slab V5? Can you climb overhanging V5? This is where I feel like, I want to empower you. Like, give yourself personal grades. You can be a slab V5 climber and an overhanging V3 climber. Guess what? That is okay. That is great if you're able to self-assess and self-analyze. There's no objective value to grades. And I always have to remind people, sometimes people say something nice to me about how quickly I can climb a certain grade or how strong I am or something. And I'm always like, well, that is great of you. Haha, here's my joke. That's great of you to say that. I take the compliment. Thank you. But it's always relative. I might seem strong to some people, but let me tell you, at the gym that I climb at, there's a lot of very, very strong climbers. They warm up on my projects. I mean, they might not even look at my projects. They are so strong. They've been climbing for a long time. But I kind of know where my place is. I am proud of where I am. This is my journey, but I also see where I could go and where I could improve, and that's totally okay. It's nice to be able to do both.
Yeah. Oh, it's really beautiful. Yeah. I did want to touch on some drama.
Mm-hmm. Go.
And how grades can create drama. Grades have created drama. I've been involved in a lot of drama around grades, a lot of personal attacks online, in person. And this was definitely during a time when I was trying to be pro. And it can really ruin relationships. And, I think if you are why are you climbing? If you feel something about grades that just isn't quite right, and you're in this group of people that might make you feel bad about grades, or where there's just a lot of tension around grades, like it's okay to maybe find another group of people to climb with, because it's sometimes just not worth having those arguments and having a lot of tension around that. And now you are putting a lot of worth into these grades. Like your worth is now attached to the grade. And I have been there, and I am so glad I don't live in that world anymore, because
Yeah.
climbing is so beautiful and it's my favorite form of movement. Um, and like this is the downside of grades, and really just be aware. And you don't always have to have an opinion on grades either. You could just climb the thing and be like, "Sweet, I just did this.
Yeah.
I feel awesome." And that's great,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um so yeah, just wanted to touch on that. But we could end on something really positive.
Well, I would love to share one more thing, but I want to speak
Yeah.
to what you said first because that is
Yeah.
so important. This idea of in climbing in general, whether or not it's grades, this could be grades, this could be comfort with safety in general, like how comfortable someone is to take risk. This could be even just feeling emotionally safe and supported. The idea of you get to choose who you climb with. This is what you're saying, just like in relationships, before you marry someone, you're going to choose someone who you share similar values, politically, financially, whether or not you want to have a family there. That is okay. Like we choose people to be around with, based on our values. And climbing is just like that. And if you climb with someone who gets really fired up about grades and you don't share that sentiment, it is okay to find a different group of people to climb with. Or even better, if both of you have a very like open, authentic, honest relationship, you could talk about it. You could like, okay, you care about this grade. I don't. So you let me be me and I will let you be you. That's another
Totally.
way of doing it.
Yeah.
There's one little pet peeve that I want to share because this might happen to people, especially people who really love practicing climbing in a skill-based way and using all like a lot of technique to climb. Is I've seen this a lot on the internet, this idea of climbs get downgraded when people find beta that now makes a move easier. And this is a pet peeve of mine because climbing is a skill sport. So if you are someone who uses a heel hook instead of jumping to a small crimp, now that is a skill that you're using that still has a lot of value. There might be people who cannot use that heel hook, maybe because of flexibility, maybe because they just, it's a very technical heel hook. Like heel hooks are technical. It's not just flexibility that you need. Um, it doesn't mean now the grade needs to be downgraded because it was physically easier. And this is why I love that you brought the RIC scale, like the complexity of the betas, that matters a lot too. I'm sharing this because if you are someone, and often, not always, it tends to be women having different beta than men, and you might not be as strong, but climbing is not just a strength sport. Strength does matter. But if we take any skill and technique out of grading, in the end, it just becomes, who is the strongest person. But that's not really what climbing is about, right? So let's keep in mind that if you do find beta that makes a move easier, that is amazing. That is wonderful. That means, yes, you take that grade because you can do it that way. That is wonderful. I once had an argument with actually a root setter, also from Seattle, don't want to share any names, about whether or not you can do this one move with a heel hook. Now, he was a lot more experienced than I was, but I really like to try things, and he was convinced you couldn't do the move with a heel hook, and I did it with a heel hook. And you know what? That is just because we're different people, and that is great. So I'm sharing this just because I want everybody listening to really find their own way in climbing and not feel like they need to climb one way or another in order to deserve the grade of a climb. Okay.
Nice.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, let's end on some positive notes. I would love to end with the post that Mercedes shared. So she wrote this really nice post with a bunch of different sayings or quotes about grades and maybe what matters most. And I would love to read my favorite one.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
And maybe Mercedes can read her favorite one for the end. So my favorite quote that she wrote is, grades track progress, which I agree with, not purpose. So grades track progress, not purpose. Climb because it moves you, not because it ranks you. I love that so much. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, the grades are not your purpose. They're not who you are. They're not your worth. Climbing really is movement. That's the beauty about the sport. It's not the grades, but it's really us moving up the rock. And it doesn't rank us because it cannot rank us. We are all human beings that are worthy of love and belonging. That's it. There's no, like, you don't rank different on that scale. Like, I'm still a worthy human being, no matter what I climb today or tomorrow or ever. You know, because there's all these people out there who don't even climb. Well, what kind of shitty people are they, huh? No, they're not. They're like great people.
Yeah.
So that's something
Yeah.
to really, really remember. And that's what I love about this quote. It's so poetic too, Mercedes. I'm
Thanks.
gonna
Thank you.
like tattoo it to my like bicep. No, I
Yeah,
really do love it. You
these.
did such a great job.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this post took me hours. And it
I
was well
know.
worth it. It was definitely
Uh-huh.
worth it. And I think I really just wanted to come up with some things for, those moments that you really think about grades and you're maybe not doing so well. Um, and maybe you do feel like your self-worth is kind of wrapped up in how hard you're climbing. So yeah, this turned out really well. So God, I don't know what my favorite is. I think this one, yeah, I'm gonna say this one. The real achievement in climbing is not reaching a certain grade, but discovering your superpowers along the way.
Oh, I love this one too. No, I
It's so
mean,
good.
honestly, if you haven't read this post, please go. Mercedes published it February 22nd on her
Yeah.
Instagram, Modus Athletica. It is wonderful.
I can
So
I
many
can leave
wonderful
a I'll
questions.
leave a link. I'll leave a link below and maybe y'all can choose your favorite one or choose the ones you love the most and leave a
Hmm.
comment. You might even have a one-liner that you might want to share with us. I mean, like
Yeah,
some people have even put theirs and it's like,
yeah,
oh,
it's
it's so
beautiful.
so lovely. Yeah.
Yeah, make sure to read the comments. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh so yeah, we'll leave
Wonderful.
it there.
Well,
Yeah.
I hope this conversation has inspired some people to change their views or perspectives on grades and hopefully feel a little bit better about themselves and the grading system.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you
All right,
everybody for
y'all.
listening.
Till next time.
Yeah. Okay, bye.
Bye.